All right. Okay, again, we are here to talk about the fiscal year 23 RFP for the Idaho Department of Lands grants programs for LSR, Western State Fire Managers, and hazard fuel reduction, administered here within the Forestry Assistance Bureau of the Idaho Department of Lands. Can I get a thumbs up or a yes if you can all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. A couple of technical announcements. We are going to be recording this webinar so we can get it posted on our grants webpage for the folks that aren't able to join us today. All participants are going to be placed on mute, and we ask that we keep everybody on mute throughout this presentation until we enter the question and answer period at the end of this presentation. Couple other things. Get everybody muted there. Again, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please use the chat box to post those. My supervisor, Tyra Holfeltz, is here in the room with me, and he's going to be monitoring the chat box and answering as we go for those that he can, and then we'll enter into discussion at the end as well. If you experience any technical difficulties during this presentation, please also use the chat box to post those, and we will try and help you the best that we can. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Corey Ivy, and I'm the Grant Project Coordinator here at the Idaho Department of Lands, and the primary point of contact for the grant proposal stage of our programs for all three of them, alongside Tyra Holfeltz. I primarily work with proposing grantees in the full development of their applications before they're submitted for competition, and I've been here doing that for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years now. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tyra for a quick introduction.
Next slide. Next slide. I'm on the next slide.
And there's Tyra.
Good morning, everybody. Tyra Holfeltz. I am the Wildfire Risk Mitigation Program Manager for the state of Idaho, and been here about 7 years or so now, and I've engaged in many of these conversations in that time. And so I've likely had a face-to-face or phone call or email with many of you who are participating today. But if not, please reach out and introduce yourself directly, because I'm always interested in building new friendships and relationships. I will be here supporting Corey through this presentation, and then answering questions as they come up and as part of the Q&A period as well. Thanks, Corey.
Perfect. Make sure to remember to transition my slides moving forward. Okay, quick overview of our programs. Funds for these programs are provided to the Idaho Department of Lands from the U.S. Forest Service State and Private Forestry Branch. And with that, we want to make sure to thank them for making this funding available to allow us to put some of these great projects out there within the state of Idaho. Idaho competes with 17 Western states and the Pacific Islands for LSR and WSFM grants. The HFR grants are ranked and scored within Forest Service regions 1 and 4. The proposal process involves a solicitation, which we sent out just this last month, for project proposals for all three of the grant programs. And we'll talk about the process involved in that and the timeline here in the next about 3-4 slides. IDL is essentially the final applicant. These programs are highly competitive, and we spend a great deal of time putting the applications together for primarily Western State Fire Managers and LSR, as the HFR ones are a little less competitive at the regional level. But we will work back and forth with proposing grantees to fully develop those applications before they're submitted. A couple of critical resources that I want to share before we dive into the process and the programs. And these resources are ones that you should refer to often and keep handy throughout the process. And additionally, utilize even if we're not in a proposal process, because we like to think that there's some great resources here within these slides for you to refer to for projects and project development. The first one is the Idaho Department of Lands grants webpage. It recently has undergone on some construction, and you'll see that it's going to look a little bit different. I'm going to do my best to share that with you here real quickly. Okay. You should now be seeing the Forestry and Fire Grants webpage. If not, please let me know in the chat. The Forestry and Fire Grants webpage is a really great resource for all the different grant programs that are administered here at IDL, but it is also the location for the information regarding the 3 programs that we're going to talk about today: landscape scale restoration, Western State Fire Managers, and hazard fuel reduction. The proposal packets that you'd need in order to submit an application or a proposal to us for this fiscal year RFP, they are located within each of the 3 tiles here that you see on the screen. Additionally, there is, get these closed for you. Thank you. There is a couple other resources down below. We'll talk about this PLA finder, Priority Landscape Area Finder, here in a little bit. The grants how-to guide is here. This is a list of other funding opportunities. And then there's some links to our other pages. So use this resource often and refer to it during your proposal development process. Get back in here to the slides. Okay, we should be back on the critical resources page. The next resource that I want to share with you is the forestrygrants.org webpage. The forestrygrants.org webpage is a compilation of all of the Western State Fire Managers and LSR competitive applications for the last 7 years now, I believe, dating back to fiscal year 2016. Go in here, take a look at the applications that were submitted, get an idea of what they look like, the kind of projects that you're going to be competing with, and utilize it to develop your proposals. You can find not only Idaho's applications here, but other Western states as well. But I encourage you to look at Idaho's completed applications because it'll show you exactly what we're striving for by the end of the development of the applications. So let's boil down the process a little bit, and then we'll continue to boil it down further as we go. The process is essentially 3 separate stages as shown here on the slide. So you've got the proposal stage, the full application stage, and then the submission stage. The proposals for this year are based on prior year applications and guidance. And that's because we do our RFP process quite a bit earlier than when they're actually due for competition. We normally see very few changes when they provide us the updated guidance, when the Forest Service provides us the updated guidance, or Western WFLC, Western Forestry Leadership Council. And if we do see any severe changes, we make sure to let our proposing grantees know of those changes so they can adjust their proposals accordingly. The full application stage comes after our IDL review and our Idaho Lands Resource Coordination Council review. I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. We completely develop the applications together collaboratively. I spend a great deal of time working with each of the proposing grantees to fully hash out their applications to make sure that they're going to compete well once they get to Western competition. And with the HFR grants, we still develop them out before they go to the region as well. And again, for that to be a true coordinated effort, we have to make sure to stay in contact and to work timely back and forth to get those developed. The final step in the process is the submission to either Western competition via forestrygrants.org or to the region via email, and that comes from our end as well. So if we look at the timeline involved in this process, you'll see here on this slide, and it'll be the next slide as well, what that kind of looks like. So last month, we sent out the RFP, We've got our webinar today. And then the big date that you need to remember here in the middle of this slide is February 4th, 2022. That is when the proposals for all three of those programs are due to the Idaho Department of Lands. Later on in February, we then sit down with our Idaho Lands Resource Coordinating Council and we share all of the proposals that were provided to us. And they provide recommendations on which projects should be moving forward. And that's all also dependent upon how many that we receive as far as which ones are selected or not. Between March and September, we develop the full grant applications. HFR applications are submitted to the region a bit earlier. So we actually will work on those rather quickly. LSR and Western State Fire Managers apps are not due until the end of September or October. They've recently changed that in the last couple of years, but we still push to have those done by September. So we're not pushing the end of the deadline. Moving forward, so by the end of October, November through December, excuse me, that is when the Western states go through their grant review, scoring, and ranking process. We typically hear something of recommendations or tentative funding by the next February. Spring, summertime, depending on congressional appropriations, that's when we'll actually hear what the funding is looking like, and we're able to provide some form of notification to the applicants on what the awarded projects are or which projects were awarded. And then in the fall, we'll start working on those agreements. Now, this timeline is very tentative. It is all dependent upon what's going on the Washington office level and what the funding looks like. But this is just a general outline of what we've experienced with the process in the last few years. So for eligibility and funding, the bottom line is refer to the guidance documents for these programs for the full gamut of eligibility criteria. Baseline, state and local agencies, tribes, nonprofits, and educational institutions are all considered eligible applicants. But again, look at the guidance because there are some other eligibility criteria involved. Funding wise, $300,000 is available for each of the grant programs. However, $240,000 is actually what we would consider contracted in quotes to the grantee through an agreement. So 240 is what's actually allocated for project work. And then the 60,000 that's remaining is for IDL's grant administration, reporting to the Forest Service, et cetera. We'll cover that with the budget tables and the packets a little bit later. This funding is provided on a reimbursement basis only. The basic process involved is that a request from the grantee for reimbursement is provided to IDL with proof of payment to a vendor, a contractor, staff time, et cetera. We review the request to make sure that the costs are allowable and allocable before any funding is provided to the grantee. So essentially, grant funds are not provided upfront. We don't consider these cash grants, et cetera. However, grantees are allowed to request reimbursement throughout the entire project period. So there's not an expectation that a grantee carries the entire $240,000 worth of project costs before they're allowed to seek reimbursement. So again, if there's any questions about the reimbursement basis piece of this, please don't hesitate to reach out, post some questions in the chat, and we can further address those questions. So along with funding, we look at these programs as essentially having three different components of funding involved. You've got grant funds, you've got match funds, and you've got leverage funds. But there's often some confusion between the difference between match funds and leverage funds. Match funding comes in the form of another grant, cash, or in-kind work on grant eligible activities. So it's got to be something that the grant itself is allowed to pay for us to consider it match. What this means is that essentially two of the three grant programs have a match requirement. So that's why this is important for folks to understand the difference. So if you're planning on doing some fields mitigation work and the landowners are going to do slash pickup or firewood pickup, that's considered a grant eligible activity. Therefore, we could consider their time and their labor as match funding. So that is match. Leverage, on the other hand, is essentially the value of contributions made by the proposing grantee and their project partners to meet mutual project outcomes. So it's above and beyond match for LSR and WSFM, and it's desired that it be 1-for-1, but that's not a requirement. For HFR, we highly encourage that there's some form of leverage funding. Again, match is not required for HFR, but we'd like to see some form of leverage for the project. Leverage values can come from federal sources. They can fund activities or items outside of grant authorities. An example would be if there's an LSR project that's doing some watershed restoration of sorts, and there's a need to put do some channel reconnecting, or there's a need to do root wads for bank stabilization below the ordinary high water mark. Those are all things that are allowed to be part of the project, but they cannot be paid for with grant funds. Therefore, they cannot be considered match. Therefore, we would consider them leverage. So again, leverage means you're implementing activities that are not grant funding eligible. So breakdown of the three different types. If there's questions about what constitutes match or leverage, it's best that you ask. LSR and Western State Fire Manager projects require a 1-for-1 match. That's why it's important for us to talk about this. HFR does not have a match requirement again. The requirement for match is 10%. So in this green bubble on the left, you're going to see an example of what that would be. If you're requesting a full $240,000, 10% of $240,000 is $24,000. So that is what we need proposals to come to the table with. You've got to show that there's that minimum match requirement for Western State Fire Managers and LSR. Bottom line here is that partnerships are important. Most of the time, we're going to see the leverage and the match funding come from projects that have been developed out with additional partners involved. Along the lines of project planning as it relates to proposal development, a couple of things that we have seen proposing grantees and awarded projects be successful with is that they've worked through a specific process to approach and go through the planning part of developing their project out before applying for these grants. I like to look at it in 3 different steps, and I've broke them down here and we'll talk through them a little bit. The first one is to collaborate. And what that is holding a series of planning meetings, inviting partners to the table, and maybe those are subject matter experts. Maybe they provide some other values. Talk about where specifically the project's going to take place. Maybe there are some different landowner types with LSR. We would hope that there are. We'll talk about that more later. Identify issues that drive the need for the project. Why is it important? Talk about the objectives that are going to address the issues. Talk about who's doing what. And sometimes in talking about who's doing what, you'll identify that maybe there are some stakeholders missing that should be at the table. And then finally, talk about possible costs that are going to be associated with the project. So that's to us one of the things that we want to recommend that any proposing grantee considers working through before applying. The second one is research. For this, there are oftentimes already available data, assessments, and maps out there that you can utilize to support your projects and the needed work. If they're not available, consider other grants. If you all recall on the grants webpage, there was that funding guide, funding opportunities reference guide at the bottom. There's a whole compilation of other grant opportunities in there. And so if there's a need to do any initial research, initial assessments, or even to pair some other types of grants with any of these ones that we administer here, take a look in that funding guide and maybe you can find what you're looking for there. The third one is quantify measurable outcomes. And this is critical because all of these grant programs need to result in some form of quantifiable widget, whether that's acres treated or trees planted or plans completed or outreach workshops conducted. We've got to have that quantifiable widget at the end of these. And then also with quantifiable measurable outcomes, talking about how you're going to achieve milestones. We got to be able to prove through these proposals that there's a thought process put in it, how you're going to reach each of those milestones to achieve those objectives. These steps realistically are not limited to the request for proposal stage. These can be happening year round, even outside of the RFP process. And we want you to know that Tyra and I, as Tyra mentioned earlier, are more than willing to be a part of these discussions and more than willing to help attend meetings, facilitate, aid in discussions, guide the process, anything that you need to help your project become successful and to truly be represented as a competitive application in the process. So please don't hesitate to reach out and ask us. we're happy to participate. Okay. The Forest Action Plan. Idaho's Forest Action Plan was updated in 2020, and the latest edition is posted on the Idaho Department of Lands website. There's a hyperlink here on this slide that you can navigate to. It was developed by a cross-section of stakeholders throughout the state, and it is essentially a modeling effort that is identifying the threats and the benefits to Idaho's forests. It also outlines strategies to address mitigating these threats and enhancing and increasing the benefits of the forests. The Forest Action Plan comes in two parts. You'll see the cover pages here on this slide. You've got part one, which is the assessment, and part two, which is the resource strategy. And this is important because all of our projects, or all project proposals, must be tied to the Forest Action Plan issues and goals. So when you're coming up with your projects, make sure that you're referring back to the Forest Action Plan to verify that it ties in with our goals and objectives here. Again, it can be found on the IDL website. Recording of this will be posted on our Idaho Department of Lands grants webpage. But if not, you can navigate to www.idl.idaho.gov. And if you hover over forestry, and then a little drop down will appear and you'll see Forest Action Plan there. And both of these PDF documents are posted there. Would you like to add anything? Okay. I am excited to announce that we have a new tool, and Tyre can attest that I've been a little bit giddy about it. This tool is extremely important for those projects associated with LSR, and frankly, for all three of them. So before we released the request for proposals this year, I was able to work with our GIS folks here at IDL, and thank you to them for putting this great thing together to create an interactive priority landscape map. For those that have gone through this process before, you know that you have to identify what priority landscape area your project falls in. And historically, we've all relied on a PDF page out of the Forest Action Plan to approximate where our projects were located within that map. This interactive tool can be found on the Idaho Department of Lands grants webpage, and I pointed it out earlier. And this is important because for LSR, the proposed project must be within a Forest Action Plan priority landscape area or special landscape area. For Western State fire managers, the proposed project either must be located within a PLA, SLA, or it has to be in an area identified as at risk for wildfire. So for that, you'd have to refer to the Forest Action Plan, but you got to know where you're first located. So I'm going to attempt to share this tool with you very quickly here. Okay, you should all be seeing the Priority Landscape Area Finder tool on your screens at this point. If you're not, again, please let us know in the chat box. So this tool is super simple. All you have to do is type in the address, place, GIS coordinates, or click on a physical location on this map, and it will tell you multiple components or multiple locations of where your project is located at. Sounds like maybe none of you are seeing it, so give me just a second here. There we go. Bit of a technical glitch. Okay, back to the top here. So this tool is extremely easy to use. You can either click on the map where you think your project's going to be located, or you can type in an address or GIS coordinates, and it will show you which PLA you're in. So to show you how this works here, I'm going to put in a completely random address. Again, this is completely random. This is not at all tied to anybody in this room. And you'll see that a white pin has popped up on the map. And it has now zoomed you in to where your project location is on the map. If you look at the left-hand side here, you'll see there are 3 different things that have popped up. And what these are is 3 different areas. You've got the shared stewardship focal area, which I'm not going to dive into, but some of you may have familiarity with what that is. You've got the shared stewardship priority landscape. Again, this is all shared stewardship program related focus. But what's important here is you'll see this priority landscape areas panhandle here in the middle. And what that is the PLA that your project is going to be located in. And you'll see in the proposal packets where it asks specifically for that information. So this tool is fantastic. I'm using it on a daily basis instead of just trying to drop a pin on my PDF paper map I've got hanging in my desk. So I highly suggest that all of you jump in here, take a look at it, play with it. You shouldn't be able to break it, but if we have any technical issues with it, please reach out to me and let me know so we can get it back up and working. And see if I could successfully switch us back over to the slides here. All right. The last thing that we want to talk about before we jump into the project proposal packets and what you'll find within them is a new executive order called 13985. And what this executive order that was put into place on January 20th refers to is it's a shift towards encouragement of implementing projects that include equity. If you are unaware or you have not heard of this executive order before, I highly suggest jumping in and taking a look at it. Tyra and I have talked a lot about this, and we do believe that there's going to be a shift in Forest Service funding that's going to ask states to include EO 13985 and equity into all of their projects and their applications. And so from IDL, we do encourage that different proposing grantees take a look at how they can incorporate this into their projects. What this is it's specifically the inclusion of benefiting historically underserved communities, and it's outlined further here. So again, the link is here on the page. If you're unfamiliar with it, please go in and take a look and do some reading. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, what this looks like with LSR, because it's already been implemented in last year's guidance. Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at before we take a quick 5-minute human needs break is the project proposal packets. So each of the packets is going to contain a set of forms. Some of the packets are a little bit different, so I'm going to walk through that real quick. The first form in all 3 of the packets is the acknowledgement form. This form is 2 pages. It must be reviewed, initialed. On the left-hand side, you'll see some X's and underlines in the table, and signed by an authorized representative of the proposing organization agency. On page 2, you'll see at the bottom that there's a print line and a signature line. When submitting an application or a proposal, excuse me, we have to have this page initialed and signed. This page covers the requirements of these programs, and it requires the proposing grantees acknowledge them via initials and signatures. There's various terms such as O&B requirements, reimbursement terms we talked about, indirect costs, what those look like, match funding requirements, and a few others. Please do not forget to have this initialed and signed before you submit your proposals to us. The next form is found in all of the packets as well, and this is the budget development guidelines and restrictions. It's again a 2-page document, and it provides critical information that's meant to guide the development of budgets. Now, you will not actually be breaking your budgets down as in detail as this form shows, but if your application in the end is funded, this is a form that you'll want to use when you fully hash out your budgets as part of the agreement process. So this form really should be kept throughout this entire process, especially if your project is awarded for funding in the end. It contains information relating to flat fees, excuse me, contractor costs, greater explanation of indirect costs, personnel costs, so on and so forth. The next form that you will see only in the LSR packet is the proposed landscape scale restoration manual. This is new for this packet, and it replaces last year's national LSR guidance document that some of you may be familiar with. This document is a draft, and this is brand new out of the Washington office this year. We do anticipate that it will be finalized as part of the upcoming guidance for fiscal year 23 that, again, we have not received yet. So there may be some slight modifications, and we'll be sure to update proposing grantees accordingly when we see this further developed and finalized. The next document is in the LSR and Western State Fire Managers packets. This is the Western guidance document, and again, dated for the prior fiscal year until we get the most updated version, typically around summertime next year. When we open up the request for proposals, again, we're almost 2 years earlier than the funding year. And if anybody has any questions about how that works or what that looks like, please don't hesitate to ask. For LSR, this guidance document is more refined and Western specific than the national LSR manual. And for Western State Fire Managers, it is the only guidance document. We cannot stress enough to read them in their entirety, front to back. They truly are what you need to lean on when looking at these programs for funding and developing proposals. Everything is in here, from what details need to be in each box to eligibility requirements, so on and so forth. The only thing I would ask that you ignore is the deadline dates associated to these guidance documents, because they are for last year and they change. So please do not take the dates in these guidance documents as set in stone for this request for proposal period. The last form that you're going to see in all of the packets is the project proposal form. And this is where you are actually going to be inputting the details of your project. The other ones are guidance documents. This is the actual fillable form, aside from the acknowledgements form, of course. So again, when you're working through these project proposal forms, keep the guidance documents handy. We're always here to answer questions, but truly, everything that is needed to develop your proposals is located in the guidance documents. And those guidance documents, along with the critical resources like the forestrygrants.org website, are going to help you to get the most points for each of the questions in these proposals. With that, we are going to take a short 5-minute human needs break. Get a drink of water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do, have a cup of coffee, and we will be back here. It's 12:05. We will be back here at 12:10 Pacific, 1:10 Mountain Time to start in on the individual programs and packets. See you all in 5 minutes. All right. Now that we have worked through all of the basic programmatic information for grants administered here at IDL, we are going to take a closer look at each of the grant programs that are part of this request for a proposal process. The first one that we're going to look at is the most cumbersome, I guess would be the right word, and requires the most pre-planning and detail for the application or the proposal, is the Landscape Scale Restoration Grant Program. The purpose statement directly out of the guidance from last year reads, to encourage collaborative science-based restoration of priority forest landscapes. IDL is able to submit a total of 5 applications, as well as 2 applications direct from a tribe. So in total, we are able to, as a state, submit 7 applications to Western competition. We are not aware of any year in which this many proposals has even been submitted to us. And the probability of more than 2 applications actually being funded with the current allocations is 0. Funding cap limitations are the reason why we will never see at the current time more than 2 applications for this program or 2 projects funded. So keep that in mind, but don't hesitate to submit a proposal just because of that limiting factor. This program and projects associated with it address the national themes of protect, enhance, and conserve, as well as landscape objectives, and those are laid out in the guidance document. The themes, the national themes, and these landscape scale objectives are the basis for which our FAP goals, our Forest Action Plan goals and objectives have been formed. So we've tied them all together nicely for you in our Forest Action Plan. All projects must align again with the Forest Action Plan goals and objectives, because if they align with the FAP goals and objectives, it is highly likely that they align with the landscape scale restoration goals and objectives and themes. So keep that in mind. The other component with this program is that there's a requirement for the technical transfer of knowledge. And what that is it's simply the sharing of knowledge and how others are going to learn from the implementation of the project. So keep that in mind when you're working on developing these projects, is how are you going to share what you've done with others so they can in turn implement similar types of projects. Okay, what is an LSR project then? What it is it's innovative, it's cross-boundary, and it is tied to the Forest Action Plan. Again, we cannot hammer down on that enough. It's got to tie to the Forest Action Plan. There are some priority projects or priority points with this new guidance that we got last year, and I anticipate they will be the same for the coming year. Those priority points will be awarded to projects that promote cross-boundary collaboration, and that's either with their proximity to other land ownerships, their inclusion of a combination of land ownerships, could be tribal ownership, state and local, so on and so forth. It could be multiple private land ownership. Project needs to touch multiple types of land ownerships or multiple ownerships. Keep that in mind. Additionally, projects will receive priority points if they coordinate with or are in proximity to other complementary landscape scale projects. Now, we're not talking about LSR for this priority point. We're talking about complementary landscape scale projects on national forest system lands or lands under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of the Interior or a state that are carried out under either the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Healthy Forest Restoration Act, so on and so forth. This is fully listed out in the guidance document. So if you're looking to really bring your application to the top of the list, consider these priority points here. Another priority point is projects that coordinate with or in proximity to other LSR projects. So if you've got a historical LSR project, maybe you're thinking about continuing it across the landscape, downstream, so on and so forth. Those phase 2 types of projects where you're piggybacking LSR projects, those will be prioritized. If you're coordinating with NRCS programs, that will be considered priority points, or other state appropriate state level programs. And additionally, priority points will be awarded to projects that leverage funding from multiple entities. And we talked about leverage earlier. So if you're pairing together 319 grants with LSR grants, with Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund grants to create this huge project, it will receive priority points. That's the best way to explain that. Not on this slide, but something we talked about earlier is Executive Order 13985, Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the federal government. So with LSR specifically, this has already been associated under the priority section of the guidance. And although we were told that this last round of grants for fiscal year 22 would not actually tie this executive order to priority points per se, we do believe that it will likely weigh in when it comes to prioritization at the Washington office and funding. So moving forward, we anticipate and highly expect that Executive Order 13985 will become a priority point piece of the LSR program. So if you're looking to implement an LSR project, think about innovatively how you could incorporate underserved communities, marginalized communities into your project. Specifically, this looks like projects that describe how communities and people that are historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty will be engaged, benefit, or be supported from the project being proposed and how the project will increase equitable access. So think creatively, get innovative, and figure out how you can tie that into your project to really increase your chances for prioritization. So we know what the program is, and we know what those projects kind of look like and what the prioritization is. Now let's talk about the different types of projects. So historically, Idaho has received funding for a multitude of different types of projects, from development of watershed action plans, community outreach projects, hazard planning, river, creek restoration projects, fish and riparian ecosystem improvements, forest economic, geospatial database development, seed orchards, the list goes on. So taking a look at this slide, and again on the next slide, think about types of projects. Maybe you have a project in mind. Does it fit within these types of projects that are laid out in the guidance document? Community tree planting. We'll talk about eligibility for population size when it comes to community type projects, but these are the types of projects that you can fund with LSR funds. Additionally, LSR does fund wildfire mitigation types of projects. More historical projects that Idaho has seen, FireWise, fire resilient state park projects, whether it's fire mitigation type work or maybe it's post-fire restoration type of work. We had a heck of a wildfire season this last year, so maybe we want to do some post-fire restoration type of work, forest enhancement projects, so on and so forth. Please remember that regardless of the type of project you do, you have to have an on-the-ground component, and that's going to tie into the next 3 slides here. So the next thing that I want to talk about with LSR is the on-the-ground national quantitative measures. These are outlined in the LSR manual and the Western guidance. The best way to go about tackling these national quantitative measures is to think SMART. And we've all heard about SMART goals in some fashion or some form with different words associated with each letter. But one that we really hone in on here is the R, because we've switched that out with realistic, the most often seen word associated with R. So in order to achieve the national quantitative measures, the objectives have to be specific. What exactly are you going to do? They have to be measurable. How are you going to measure whether or not you've been successful? They need to be achievable. We're going to treat 500,000 acres. I don't know. Think about ones that you actually are going to be able to achieve in a 3-year time period. They must be reportable, and that is key. We have to be able to report in the system what specifically has been done. And then time-based, because we got to talk about milestones, right? And how you're going to achieve those milestones. So, you know, in year 1, we're going to do some site prep. In year 2, we're going to plant. In year 3, so on and so forth. So think SMART when you're trying to approach these national quantitative measures.
I didn't understand that.
More about these requirements. This table can be found in the guidance document. So when you look at this table, you've got 3 different columns. You've got the category, you've got the description, and you've got the measure. The category, as you could see, is a different type of quantitative component, whether it's hazard fuels, maybe it's invasive plant management, so on and so forth. In the middle, there's a description of what that category is. And on the right, there's the measurement. So if we look at, let's take the hazard fuels management piece. 3rd down from the top. In the middle, it's acres treated to reduce hazard fuels, so on and so forth. And then the actual measurement is how many acres were treated. So you've got to hit the how many. It's that reportable and quantifiable result. And on this next slide, this is a continuation of the same table. So again, here's some more categories, water quality, so on and so forth. One thing I want to point out is you'll see that some of them are duplicates. So water quality enhancement is on here twice, and wildlife habitat enhancement is on here twice. And what it is a difference between acres versus miles. So you could fit into those categories in 2 different ways on this one. Again, these are in the guidance documents. So make sure that you take some time to look and see how your project's going to achieve these. And for the funding restrictions, every grant program has funding restrictions, right? So for LSR, grant funds cannot be used in communities with populations greater than 50,000. This is new-ish. I think this requirement's been in place for the last 2 years, I believe. So if you're talking about trying to do some community projects, some innovative projects in communities, make sure that you check with the population census. There is a tool. I don't have the link for it here, but if you're concerned that you may be trying to focus a project in a population that's right on that cusp, shoot me an email or give me a call and I will hop into that tool and we can see if you're technically within that requirement or not. It's an innovative tool that was put out by the Forest Service and I got to go find it. Grant dollars cannot be used for work on federal land. Federal partners are great. Adjacency to federal work is great. Leveraging federal work is great, but we cannot use this money to do work on federal land. We cannot use this money for research. If you have questions about what constitutes as research, please reach out and ask. We can't fund construction activities as laid out here on the slide, and we cannot fund activities in the water. This one gets folks more often than anything else. If you are doing riparian restoration, watershed enhancement, anything of the sorts, you're going to need to look to another program to leverage to connect these two. Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund, 319, et cetera, something that you can use to do the work in the water, or maybe you're funding it on your own, that's fine too. But something to do the work in the water and then use LSR for the above the ordinary high water mark activities. If you want some further clarification on this restriction, please ask. Just because we can't fund this stuff doesn't mean it can't be part of the project. So if these activities are part of your project, consider them leverage. They cannot be considered match because they're ineligible for LSR. So we like projects that leverage other pots of funding. Okay, we're going to take a quick look at the LSR proposal packet. Give me a second here to transition over. Okay, you should see the acknowledgement form that we discussed earlier on your page. I am going to scroll through this and all the guidance documents because we've already covered them. Try not to make you all dizzy as I scroll to the bottom. Ooh, almost there. Come on. Okay. Ooh. There we go. So this is the project proposal form for LSR. This form is 10 pages long. Again, this is the most in-depth proposal of all of them. I'm going to scroll through the primary information on the top. It's pretty straightforward. One note, if you're going to do a multi-state proposal, please check with us first, because there's a lot of other things that we have to do in order to submit that type of a project. Coming down, you've got your GIS coordinates. So this is where you're going to actually input where your project will be located or the area that you're going to be targeting. In each of these boxes, I need to note that there is a thing called hover notes. Let's see if I can get them to turn on here. Well, it doesn't look like this version is going to let me do it. So if you hover over the box, you will see a little sticky note of sorts that pops up, and it will give you further instruction on what to put in these boxes. So keep an eye out for that. And I know for sure it should be working on the Western State Fire Manager's one. At the top of every box is a breakdown of what's required in each of the boxes to include evaluation criteria. So this is what scorers are going to be looking for when they're grading these projects. Context goals and objectives. Again, the landscape objectives I mentioned earlier, those are going to need to be linked in here. Proposed activities. What specifically is going to happen? Who's paying for what? Who's doing what? We want the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how for each one of the activities. And that includes leverage funding. So if you're going to be leveraging other pots of money to implement projects, that's also included there. This is the budget table. You'll notice on the left-hand side under grant funds requested that there's 30,000 listed for personnel labor, just over 7 for travel, contractuals 240, excuse me, and indirect costs is 22,000. The only piece that a proposing grantee needs to be worried about here on that white column is the 240. Everything that you do is considered contractual to us as far as this proposal goes. So the personnel, travel, and indirect cost monies that are allocated in that left column, that's the total 60,000 for the IDL grant administration. When we submit these applications for LSR, the only component that is associated with the proposing grantee is that 240. Now, the match column, the non-match, those two columns are where you're going to outline what your match dollars and what your leverage dollars are going to be associated with category wise. For the time being, for proposals, do not worry about the source column. This is something that I populate later based off of the partners listed in the top box. So do not worry about putting anything in the source column. I'm not going to go through the rest of these boxes, but the rest of them, same thing. Your criteria is at the top of each box. And your character limitations are here. Note that these boxes are limited in characters according to the requirements. So it will not let you put more than 2,500 characters in this deliverable and outcome box. If you need any assistance working through this, I'm happy to help. So please don't hesitate to reach out and I can walk through it with you. So I'm going to pause share and switch it back over to our presentation to Western State Fire Managers. Okay, for Western State Fire Managers. The point of this program is to assist eligible entities in efforts to modify fire behavior, protect life, and protect property. And you'll see that this program and HFR are going to be very similar. We are allowed to submit 10 applications each year as of the current guidance. With that, current allocations typically limit us to like 6 and a partial project. So if we get 10 applications, automatically know that there are not going to be some with current allocations that'll receive funding. And of course, this is a competitive review process, so keep that in mind as well. There are 3 different project types associated with Western State Fire Managers. You've got fuels projects, which are the primary for most of the states. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. Outreach prevention education projects and CWPP planning, assessment, and monitoring projects. So that's the primary focus for this program. Who can apply? So we've already talked about the baseline eligibility for our programs, but with Western State Fire Managers, it's a little more specific. Any county with proof the project is predetermined and pre-identified in a CWPP. Same goes for local and state agencies, and same goes for nonprofits. So there's a theme here. If you're submitting a Western State Fire Manager proposal, you need to be familiar with the CWPP for the area that you're focusing your project in, and you need to know how it fits with the CWPP, in addition to the Forest Action Plan. I will say that. Now, if there's another plan alongside the CWPP, or maybe it's an all hazard mitigation plan with a wildfire chapter, note that that is also allowable. So again, the recurring thing for Western State Fire Managers is associated with the county wildfire protection plan. And then the other component here that is extremely important is that the proposing grantee has the capacity to manage an on-the-ground project. These projects can be cumbersome. There's a lot that has to go into it to include the reimbursement, the reporting, so on and so forth. So make sure that there's both the fiscal capacity and the labor force capacity to take on a project. So what specifically is a WSFM project? A Western State Fire Manager project could be a fuels project, like mentioned earlier. Again, explicitly identified in the CWPP. We're talking about fuel breaks. We're talking about forest thinning, defensible space, watershed protection, those types of projects. 85% of the total funds for Western State Fire Managers go to fuels projects. In fact, only 15% of annual funding is allowed to be applied to other project types. So most of the projects we see are on the ground fuels reduction. Outreach and prevention projects or outreach education types of projects, again, explicitly identified in a county wildfire protection plan. Cannot stress that enough. For these types of projects, we're talking about school educational events, fairs, HOA meetings, social media outreach, so on and so forth. But please remember that there's still a requirement for a quantifiable widget. So how many events are going to be held? How many fairs are going to be attended? How many HOA meetings are going to be attended? So on and so forth. There still has to be that quantifiable widget in the end. And the last project type is their planning, assessment, CWPP updates, monitoring types of projects. And you'll see the bullet explicitly identified in a county wildfire protection plan. We're talking about development and updates to CWPPs or all hazard plan updates that include the CWPP elements and more specifically only the wildfire chapter or appendix of of a hazard mitigation plan. So if you're planning on doing a CWPP update with these funds, it's probably best for you to reach out to myself, more so Tyra Hofeltz, to discuss using this funding to update a CWPP. Again, there's always going to be some funding restrictions. Ineligible activities for this funding, solely individual, homeowner defense, defensible space. Look to, I think FEMA has some funding out there to do this with. There are other funding opportunities available. We cannot grant monies to John Smith and doing defensible space on his own cabin. This is community-wide funding. We cannot fund maintenance on previously federally funded fuels projects. So if 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we went and did a shaded fuel break on 10 acres in X county, and we cannot go back and do maintenance on that same project site. That is considered ineligible. We cannot do preparedness and suppression capacity building. In fact, if any applications come to us with the words capacity building in them, we are really going to take a closer look because we cannot submit a proposal or we cannot submit an application with those words in it. It automatically raises red flags. Small business startup GIS database development, also ineligible. This is not all inclusive, but this is the big hitters that we typically see. So keep those in mind. We're going to take a quick look at this project proposal. Okay, again, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. All right, so this project proposal looks a little different than the previous one. Again, I'm going to kind of zip through this first page because it's all contact information primarily. You'll note the applicant is the Idaho Department of Lands here. Project information, please do not forget to put a reference point name or an area name for your GIS coordinates. This is important for us to verify its location. Taking a look at the budget, again, you'll see the white column here on the left. It's already broken down with the IDL 60,000 in indirect travel and personnel labor. You will not be able to adjust those because that is our 60,000 portion. Contractual 240. I did not mention with LSR, but I'm going to bring it up now. If you're not looking to get the full 240,000 for your project, please reach out to us first before you submit it so we could talk through that a little bit. We typically only submit applications for Western State Fire Managers and LSR at the full grant amount. So we'll want to chat about that before we move forward. And again, match applicant here. Even though it says applicant, if you've got match funding coming in, maybe it's landowner contributions, maybe it's your organization's contributions, you're going to outline that here in its own category. And then non-federal contributors, that would be our leverage spot. So make sure that you fill those out to prove that you're meeting the match requirements for Western State Fire Managers. Unlike LSR, this application is almost pre-populated for you. We ask that you don't change the layout that we provided in some of these boxes, because this is what it's going to go back to in the end anyway. So it's best to use this to guide the development of your application. You'll see that on this one, the pop-up has worked, and it's a little small for you to read on this share screen. But what this says is it's basically a breakdown of what we do and don't want you to do with these boxes. So for here, don't alter what's in here, add to it where it says add details, so on and so forth. Every box in this proposal is going to have that hover note. Please use it, because it will further break down everything that you need to include in these boxes and things that we're looking for. Again, you'll see the same thing here. Add the project area description, add the project type description, and then include your challenges. So we've tried to make this proposal really, really simple to work through. Forest Action Plan and CWPP, we need to tie what priority landscape area this project is found in. If it is not in a PLA, we need to verify that it's in an area identified at high risk for wildfire. So at least include the area if it's not in a PLA, and go back and use that interactive tool to associate where your project is located in comparison. The county CWPP, we have to have both the FAP and the CWPP tie in this box. So make sure there's both. And then an overall statement of how this project addresses the goals for both. If you need assistance identifying what goals the Forest Action Plan has that tie to your project, reach out and ask, but more importantly, get familiar with the Forest Action Plan. The goals are outlined in there, and it's pretty easy to pick out which ones are going to be associated with your project. So we ask that you do a little bit of legwork to come up with those before reaching out. Okay, you've got the proposed activities box. Again, these boxes are limited in characters. You won't be able to put over the certain character limit annotated at the top of each box when you're filling these out. So keep that in mind. I'm going to talk for a second about landscape impacts. The hover over note in this box is really important. This box is not the rolling hills and the valleys and all these structures. It's not a description of what the landscape is where your project is occurring. It's a description of how your project ties into other projects in the area, how your project is going to have a greater impact on the general area. Okay, so make sure that we're not talking about the rolling hills and the sunsets in this box, please. Sometimes you're going to have to do a little historical digging on this, because you're going to find that we're needing project details that it's associated with. If you're tying up against a previously completed project, we're going to want to know what year, what project, and how many acres. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this box. Collaboration, who's providing what money for match and what they're doing. That's important here. The timeline, we've provided an example for you here on what it should look like. Try and follow this example. You're going to have to delete it because you'll run out of character space. So I'd suggest maybe copy and paste it to use as a reference. Excuse me. And then lastly, sustainability. One thing to note, when we're talking about education for sustainability, we're talking about maintenance education. How are landowners going to be educated on how to complete the maintenance on their parcel after project completion, those types of things. So when you're talking about sustainability, we're talking about the maintenance component. Any questions about the proposal? Plug them into the chat. Tyra's keeping an eye on it, and we can also bring them up at the end of the presentation. Shift back over to do HFR, and then we will transition to the Q&A portion. All right. Lost you here. Hold on a second. All right. So hazard fuels reduction. I mentioned earlier that this program and Western State Fire Managers are extremely similar. I have 3 slides for this program. one of which is the proposal packet slide. So hazard fuels reduction, similar to Western State Fire Managers, is meant to modify fire behavior to protect life and property. Same thing. The funding for this program, however, is dependent upon the availability of Forest Service regional funding with regards to exactly how much money is going to be available. Projects must be in a CWPP, just like Western State Fire Managers, but there's an adjacent requirement that I'm noted here on the slide. Projects for HFR, in order to qualify for HFR, must be within 1.5 miles of a federal project. It's highly important if you're trying to use HFR to fund your project that you tie in with your Forest Service or your federal counterparts to figure out if it's in proximity to one of their projects. And the project needs to be either planned in the next 3 years, correct? And then, or currently being implemented or has occurred in the recent time period. 3 years, has to have been completed in 3 years. Thanks, Tyler. So side-by-side comparison with Western State Fire Managers and HFR. Federal adjacency for HFR does not have to be there for Western State Fire Managers. The project work does not require match for HFR, but it does for Western State Fire Managers. And lastly, for HFR, if you're doing any form of education, which typically there's some of a component, for HFR, it has to be project area specific only. We can't do countywide newsletter blasts if your project area is not that big, which it likely isn't. We're talking about if you're implementing fuels reduction work in a community or in an HOA, only doing education within the community or within the HOA. It's got to be specific. For Western State Fire Managers, we could do general education. We can do social media pushes. We could do newsletter blasts. We can do fairs, so on and so forth. So those are the three differences between the two programs. Short and sweet. Let me jump over to the proposal because it does look a little bit different. Okay, last bit, folks. Thanks for hanging in there. You'll remember I noted that there's no guidance document in this packet. The Western State Fire Managers guidance document is your closest reference. And these programs, as you've seen, are asking for the same types of details. So you're better off looking at the Western State Fire Managers guidance document than trying to just complete this without any reference. You do have some program information located here at the top of the proposal form. Read through this. Here's your adjacency requirements, so on and so forth. So make sure that you read through the top of this packet, or this proposal form, I should say, excuse me. Basic information, applicant information, okay? Community at risk information. So we need community names. And then here's your GIS coordinates, your Latin long for the project area. Here's the budget table. You'll notice that I've left the contractual blank. A lot of our HFR projects, depending on the region, will not be the 240,000. So I've allowed you to put in here whatever number you would like. This is the only proposal that has a non-adjustable project expense number. So again, the 30, the 7727, and the indirect 22273, those are IDL, so you cannot change those. And if you do end up putting a lesser number in here, there's no need to reach out ahead of time. That's only for LSR and Western State Fire Managers. Leverage funds, again, not a requirement, but highly desirable. So if there's any leverage funding, please make sure that you put it here. You'll see there's dollars versus in kind. So separate them accordingly and according to the categories on the left. A little bit different here for the proposal project summary. You'll see it's broken out by boxes. Name of the Forest Service project adjacent to this treatment. This is where you'll need to be in contact with your local federal counterparts to figure out what project yours is going to tie in with, including their contact information. That's important. Duration of the project, 1 or 2 years. Typically, all of our projects are full 2-year or full 3-year for the other programs. Number of acres you're going to treat, so on and so forth. These boxes are pretty explicit, and it's pretty cut and dry what you're doing here. The timeline, working timeline, milestones, timeframes, etc. This is the simplest project proposal form out of all 3 programs. County Wildfire Protection Plan. The answers in all of these boxes should be yes. Because like I said, it needs the CWPP needs to be there, or it needs to be in development. And this project needs to be associated and explicitly within that plan. Whew. Okay, project area description. A lot like Western State Fire Managers, we need to include vegetation types here. The scope of work, a lot like the activities box in Western State Fire Managers. Interagency collaboration, again, this is a breakdown, just like the Western State Fire Managers box, of who's doing what. And how they're cooperating with this, or how they're collaborating on this project. And then the last box is maintenance and sustainability, just like the Western State Fire Managers box. We're talking about, environmental factors that have to do with maintenance, monitoring commitments for maintaining the project work, et cetera. And that's it. Very simple project proposal. Okay. That's all I have for presentation material. Hour and 15 minutes, just like I had hoped. So with that, I'm going to transition over to Tyre and the chat box and see if there's any unanswered questions there. If you haven't put it in the chat box yet, this is your time to do it. If you have a bit of a detailed question that you'd like to ask, let's see, I believe we can do a hand raise function, and it'll pop up on our screen and we can call on you to unmute so we're not talking over the top of each other. So we'll give it a few seconds here to see if any questions pop up. While we're waiting, Tyre, are there any questions that you think would be worth sharing?
If you haven't been following the chat, there was a question put in here about the purchase of equipment. The Forest Service programs allow for the purchase of equipment, but IDL's internal policies preclude equipment purchase. So the answer to that particular question is no at this time. If something changes, you all will be the first to know.
Anything else? I'm surprised we haven't seen a question, or maybe you have, about doing work in the water.
Nope.
As most often a question asked. Easy. Well, we will hang on here. I will hang on here until everybody has left the room. So if there are any lingering questions, I'll be available. We're always available via email. You can see on this slide all of our contact information, cell phone numbers, desk phone numbers, email. We are available. Again, proposals are due by February 4th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So anybody who's on Mountain Time, please make note of that. Examples are at the Forestry Grants page, and the packets are within each program specific tile on the Forestry Fire Grants IDL webpage. So that's where you can find the packets. If there are any technical issues or any concerns with those or what's needed, please don't hesitate to ask. And again, if you're working through your planning process and you would like any assistance or for one of us to attend your meetings, please reach out. We are more than happy to do it virtually and sometimes available to do it in person. So with that, I will let you all continue on with your day and remain available as we close out. Thank you so much.